Good morning, class. Today we are going to do a brush finish on this red oak recessed panel door. You would have gotten one of these in class if we were still at school, unfortunately. So I do want to demo how to do a brush finish because not everybody is going to want to run out and buy a piece of spray equipment. Now you may notice something too. If you notice my fingers here, well, what is that I have? They look like finger cuts. Actually, it's just 1-inch masking tape. What I found early on, and those old guys that I used to apprentice with, they let me sand until my fingers were bleeding. And then they mentioned, oh, did I tell you about putting masking tape on your fingers to save your fingers from getting bloody? So, thank you. Anyways, it's a quick thing to do out in the field. If you don't have the sanding gloves that are available today, just use some masking tape. It works well. After about an hour or so of sanding, you're going to find that the tape is going to get worn out, and then you're going to have to change it. So what I did here today is I sanded this like we've done in class to 220. I went 150 because these come sanded through the drum sander at 100. So I went 150, 180, then 220. Then I raised the grain. I knocked the raised grain back down with some 220. And then we're ready to go on to the next step. Now you'll see a lot of things written about how to take off any sanding dust. You can use a tack rag, you could use a dusting brush. Personally, I like to use an air compressor, and I do that because on this particular sample, this is red oak. Well, oak is an open grain wood, if you remember, and all that sanding dust can be in the open grain, and it may not be picked up with just a dust brush or even with those tack rags that you'll see. Another reason why I don't like tack rags is it's cheesecloth that they soak into varnish and linseed oil, so they're very sticky. If I was going to use a waterborne finish and there's any traces of that tack cloth, that residue from it, that linseed oil, you can have an adhesion problem with the clear finish. So I prefer to use compressed air, or you could use a shop vac if you wanted to vacuum the dust off. So now we're going to actually apply our dye. Now, since we're going to use a water-based dye today, this is from the Artie Dye Company. We used a half a teaspoon of number 128 orange and an eighth of a teaspoon of number 118 gray. We mixed that into 5 ounces of hot distilled water, and then to that we added 5 ounces of room temperature distilled water, strained our solution, and now we're actually ready to apply our solution. So, will you have a recessed panel door? A lot of articles, if you may read or see on the internet, they'll say, go ahead and flood the dye on the surface and wipe off all of the excess. That's fine if you're doing a tabletop and it's a flat surface, or your little 4x5 pieces of wood. Now you have inside corners to deal with. You have this center panel, which is a veneer panel that is slipped underneath both sides, the top and bottom. If you flood that dye in, it's going to get to the end of that panel, and as it dries, it's going to wick out, and it may dry with a hard water line here and here. So I'm going to show you a trick on how to prevent that from happening. This particular brush is from the Pt1 company, P-U-R-D-Y. This is a blend of nylon and polyester bristles. You do not want to use a pure bristle brush into a water-based product, whether it be a dye color like this or whether it be a waterborne clear finish. What will happen is it'll ruin those bristles, cause them to dry out, and the brush will get like this if you've ever seen brushes that's happened to. This is a very good quality brush, and it's really important to spend a little bit more money. As you can see, as I'm drawing my fingers across the top, these bristles are cut at different lengths. A very cheap and inexpensive brush, they would be cut at one length only. Also, if we were able to look at these bristles at the very end under a microscope, you would see that they're flagged. They're like split ends. That's really good for a good quality brush. It's also the bristles are set into 3 separate rows. So we have a brush that's going to hold a lot of material and release a lot of material. But for practical application today, we're not going to use this brush. It's a little large for this particular door sample. We are going to use just a little chip brush, but I'm going to show you a couple of tricks on how to use this. Remember, dip it in, don't let it soak in there. Tap it, and we're going to start it away from the side edge and away from the top and bottom. And we're going to brush that out and brush it into the corners. I don't want to get too much of that dye color on the surface, and I don't want to flood it and let it go underneath that end panel, because guess what's going to happen as it starts to dry, if it goes all the way to the end of that panel, it's going to wick out and dry with a hard water line. Have a putty knife and a rag handy and just take that and get it into the corner without flooding it on the surface. Again, starting it away from the edges and moving the liquid, the dye, towards the edges. And I don't have to have a lot of dye either. You can see it'll show you when it's time to reload the brush. So I always like to start in and work my way out. I'm keeping the bristles, I'm actually pushing down. I don't want to flick it because I don't want to get dye color onto the other surfaces. I'm not ready to move on to that yet. Same thing again, I'm going to pull that cloth over that putty knife, go into the corners, wipe off the excess off the surface itself, and there you have it. Now we have the center panel that's done, and then we're going to start working our way out towards it. Dip the brush in a little bit, take it, and try to brush it and just get it on that one edge. If you get a little onto the panel right now while it's wet, it's no big deal. While that's wet, I'm going to take this and try to keep that wet edge going. That's the one thing that's difficult when using dyes like this that are the carrier is water. Keeping that wet edge going. The hotter it is, the more difficult that is to do. Take it on its edge like this and catch that. Dip it back in. Start away from the top. Got that nice wet edge. Wipe off any excess. If you take a little bit of clear liquid dish soap, that'll actually act like a retarder would in lacquer. If you were to put some of that dish soap in there, it'll slow down the evaporation rate of the water. Today's not an issue because it's nice temperate weather. It's only about 70 degrees right now. Summertime would be a different issue. Now I'm going to wipe off excess dye color. This is what it's going to look like with clear finish on it. Once the water evaporates out, it's going to dry a shade or two lighter. So when you're trying to judge the color and what it looks like with finish on it, when it's wet is a good indicator. All the water has evaporated out of our dye color, so we're going to move on to our first coat of clear finish. And you may say, well, why aren't we going to color the backside? Because I want to get a coat of finish on the fronts, and when we turn it over, I don't want to scratch that color at all. If right now with no finish on it, if we turned it over and we had a cross grain scratch, it would show up when you put your first coat of clear finish. So I like to do the presentation side, which is the front, and put a coat of finish on that first. Also, if you noticed, I have a box here with a nice clean cloth to where I don't scratch the back of it because I've already finish sanded this to 220. So the finish we're going to use today is an oil-based polyurethane varnish. So what's the difference between urethane varnish and, you might say, varnish? It's the resin. This particular resin is the urethane resin. It is a man-made resin. They take a resin like this urethane, they introduce it into a drying oil. They heat up the drying oil. So what would the drying oil be? That would be linseed oil. To that, they add some other surfactants, but they also add, in this case, paint thinner. So what I like about this particular product over a waterborne clear finish is much more durable. It's more scratch resistant, it's more heat resistant, and it's more abrasion resistant. So this is a great finish for kitchen cabinetry, bathroom cabinetry, kitchen table, breakfast table, and I've used a lot of this over the course of my life. So we're going to brush this on, and the brush we're going to use is also from the Purdy company, P-U-R-D-Y. The difference in this one versus this one, if you remember, this one is nylon bristles and polyester bristles. This is for waterborne products, paints, clear coats, dye colors. Could I use it in this particular oil-based varnish? I could, but I find that natural bristles like this is a combination of Chinese bristle and ox hair. So they take these bristles from the ox and from the Chinese pig. They blend these together, again like the other brush. These are cut at different lengths. It's set into multiple rows, and also the tips are flagged, like split end hairs. A great quality brush. I've had this brush for probably 2 years, and it still performs really, really well. If you notice the handle, it's not painted bright red, it's not painted bright or black, glossy black. It's left unfinished, and they do that for a reason. When I show you how to clean this, and we're going to end up cleaning it in acetone, what do you suppose the acetone would do to that paint? It's going to start breaking it down. You're trying to clean the bristles out, and now all of a sudden you're mixing either red or black paint in with trying to clean the product out of the bristles itself. So they leave it unfinished. It has a cutaway here. Typically I'll put 3 fingers here, my thumb on the back side, and then this finger here. Let the bristles do the work, let the brush do the work. In this case, this is a brand new quarter finish. I don't need to strain it. I've dipped in the bristles about maybe 1/4 of the way up. I'm starting away from the corners and just working it into the corners. Oil-based finishes, oil-based varnishes like this, whether it be an alkyd varnish or a urethane varnish like this, they dry rather slowly. That's a good thing. Gives you plenty of time to brush it out. They tend to be more what they call self-leveling films. As you put brush marks into it, it dries slowly. The brush marks tend to dissipate and go away. The downside to it is it stays wet for a long time. In your shop or on the job site, what's going to happen is airborne particles will attach to a wet film. When it dries, you'll touch it and you go, well, this is really rough. Also, unlike lacquer, where if you remember in class, each coat melts into the previous coat, that's not true with a varnish finish like this. It's very important after this is dry that you lightly sand it and abrade it and break the hard surface to it to where the next coat will adhere to it. So I'll sand this after tomorrow. I'm off camera. You don't need to see that. And then dust it off with the air compressor and then move on to a second coat. This is called tipping it off, laying off the finish. I brush it on very quickly. Now you can see how much darker it gets the minute the finish goes on it. That's what I was telling you about when the water evaporates from the dye color. It's a shade or two lighter than what it was when it was wet. Same thing, I'm working the center panel, working out towards the edges. So if you notice, I just have a little bit of the bristles coming onto that little detail. I go back and forth and level that off. Now I'll take it out here and then work it towards the edges, trying to prevent it from getting too much wrapping around that other side. I'm not ready to move on there yet. Now on this side here, instead of brushing like this where the bristles are going to wrap around, I'm going to take it on its edge, and I will just get that wet, lay that off. Now I'm ready to move on to here. Brushing, especially a finish that dries slowly like this, it's actually not that difficult. Brushing a waterborne finish takes a lot more skill and a lot more patience because it evaporates so quickly. See, on the edge like so. Then I'll take it, lay that off, and leave it alone. So there's not a lot of brushing that goes on. The one mistake I see a lot of people make with the brush is they tend to go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. You want to lay the material on and leave it alone. So this is called laying it off. Tip it off like so. Move this around. Some squeezes out when I get to the corner. I'll just take a little bit of the bristles and lay that off. Now if you notice this, these bristles are also cut straight. I do not like angular brushes personally. What happens with an angular brush, you can only use it one way basically, and they get more bent over and more bent over. When I have a brush that's straight cut, I can use it this way, then I can turn it this way and bend it back all day long to where at the end of the day the bristles are going to be straight. Also, those old guys that I used to work with, I showed up with an angular brush one day and they go, "What is that thing?" I go, "Well, it's for cutting in the window sash." And they said, "Look, kid, if you can't cut a straight line with a straight cut brush, get off the job." Brutal. I got a little squeeze out right there. I'll just use the brush to remove that. There you have it. First coat, polyurethane, oil-based varnish. You're going to notice it's going to start to flatten out. It'll have no sheen to it, and by the time it dries, it'll probably be almost dead flat. This will have to dry overnight before I can sand it and recoat it again. Because of the linseed oil component to that, it takes overnight dry time to where you can move on to the second coat.